Welcome to this Killick Explains video. This week, how baby boomers can help boomerangers. Sounds a bit surreal, so what's the scenario? Well, it's a very common one, actually. The problem is this. Typically, parents hope their children will leave home at some point. Usually that point is when they, for example, head off to university, and from there, they've kind of fled the nest, they're launched. But actually what's happening for an increasing number of families is, sure, the children leave home, disappear off to do further education, university studies for example, and then come straight back home again, unable to afford to live any other way. And that's created often for the parents who might be baby boomers, who lived through a particularly fortunate period, as I'll remind you in a moment. That leads to the boomerangers, the generation of young people who appear to have no option but to move back in with their parents. It's the only way they can afford to actually live. Now, I'm not saying that people don't love their children, but clearly this is potentially quite a big problem to solve. The Office for National Statistics have some stats on how big a problem this is. In 2013, over 3.3 million adults aged 20 to 34 were living with their parents. And if you wonder how many that is, that's 1 in every 4 in that particular age bracket. And to get an idea of the way that the problem's changing and evolving and growing, since 1996, that's a 25% increase, despite the fact the absolute number of these people hasn't actually changed very much. So, quite a sizable problem. And it's a problem that's afflicting more and more parents for reasons that I'll cover in just a moment. Now, why is it happening? Well, here's a big one. Students are graduating with large university debts. That wasn't true when I was at university. When I was at university, tuition fees were paid, my accommodation was subsidised. That's no longer the case for most people at university. Property is expensive in many parts of the country, so getting it anywhere near the property ladder, if you've accumulated debts already, seems like a kind of distant prospect for most young people. Jobs are often poorly paid in the early years. Well, they always were, okay, but that hasn't changed any. And baby boomers, I guess, are perceived as being able to afford to have their children back in the family nest, at least for a while, whether or not that's true. So, what are we going to try and do about it? Now, there are a couple of strands to this presentation. One is things we can do that will help children who might become baby boomerangers, if you like, not to do it, to get them out of that problem. And secondly, ways that their families can help them avoid the trap. So, first of all, what can we tell them from an early age as possible? I cover this in other videos about helping your children, but what can we do to help them from as early age as possible? And the answer is they've got to get to grips with how money works, basic budgeting, and the importance of clearing debt and saving money as early as possible. It's not the most exciting topic in the world, which is why no one bothers, but it is becoming absolutely critical because boomerangers do not have the same advantages as baby boomers, and I'll remind you what those are in a moment. So, very briefly, the truth about money is pretty brutal. Yes, you might win it, marry it, or inherit it, but that's rather assuming the world owes you a living. For most of us, the only way you're going to get hold of the stuff is to earn it, and then make compounding work for you the moment you can afford to start saving. And a lot of people underestimate how powerful that force can be, and I'll give you an example of how powerful it can be in just a moment. So, knowing where money comes from and the fact it doesn't grow on trees is quite a good starting point, bearing in mind that boomerangers are people who in the past might have had everything paid for by their parents. Secondly, basic budgeting, not the most exciting topic, but once you are a responsible young adult, you need to have a grip on some basics. So, there's income, which you want to try and maximise. There are your expenses, which you want to try and minimise. And this is, sucking eggs for anyone who's actually been in finance for a while, but for anyone who hasn't and is new to it, it isn't necessarily, and the difference is what's left to either pay down debt or start saving. So the name of the game, maximise that, minimise those, and maximise that as far as possible. Now, practical steps for boomerangers, all right? There is no reason why, whilst they're waiting for that golden job to turn up, they can't do other work. I've done it. When I was waiting for my big postgraduate job, I did everything from working in a Tesco store to driving a meat truck to working on a farm. It all pays money. And there are jobs out there just like that. Another thing is that, parents, whilst you may love your children and want to keep them in the family home for as long as possible, the reality is that kids need to be aware that life costs money. So you could think about charging them a nominal amount, at least, for rent, food and bills, because that will get them focused on, well, that's what I've got to make sure I earn so I can live. Anything else is a bit of a bonus. All right, but let's not go mad on the other stuff, the kind of discretionary stuff, the holidays, the nights out and so on, until we're fairly sure we've sorted out a strategy for paying down debt and or saving money. So it's all fairly basic nuts and bolts stuff. It's not the most exciting stuff in the world, but eventually kids will thank you for pointing some of this stuff out to them. But in fairness, it's not all about them. As baby boomers, all right, as people of a certain generation, there is no doubt about it, there was a rather magical era of high property prices, the 1970s property boom, the mid-1990s property boom. There was an era where education wasn't expensive like it is now. There was an era where you got predictable pensions, which you don't get now. They're called defined benefit or final salary pensions, and they've all but vanished these days. And there was a time when the welfare state was expanding, but it isn't now. So whereas a baby boomer could afford to be a little bit selfish and say, well, I've got a nice defined benefit pension, welfare state's expanding, got some house price booms underneath me, and I own a property, etc., etc. And now that's not true. If we don't help our kids, the boomerangers are evidence of what can go wrong, if you want to see it that way. So the support network within families is becoming vital. And there's some good news here, in a way. If, on average, projections are true that girls born today will live to 100, then you could easily get to a situation, if you haven't got there already, where 4 generations within the same family are alive at the same time. So there are plenty of mechanisms that allow great-grandparents, grandparents and parents to help these people early and try and get them out of that boomeranger trap, because that's the name of the game here. Now, I'll just suggest a few helpful products. I won't go through these in any detail. I cover them in other videos. But junior ISAs, up to £4,080 per year, can be effective if you start early enough. Child SIPs. And now you might say, well, helping them fund their pension, that's a heck of a long way off. But if you think about it, if you're funding a pension that, say, kicks in at 60 and they're projected to live on average to 100, that's 40 years you're helping them out with. Up to £3,600 can go in, and a chunk of that comes from the government. And then there are family trusts, which won't work for everybody and something you want to seek advice on, but can be another way to kind of tax effectively plan for the future on behalf of your children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Now, just to give you an illustration to finish off as to how powerful compounding can be, letting money make money for long enough, if you were to put £2,880 once on behalf of a child aged 2 into a pension for them, that would straight away, under the current rules, become, in effect, £3,600 invested. All right, run that from the age of 2, just one contribution, up to the point where they're 60, so I'm taking a very long-term view, and look at that. That could turn into, at 5%, £61,000 of purchasing power. Now, were that 5%, there's no guarantee, were that to become 7%, a little bit bullish you might say in the current environment, then that rises to £182,000. That's a pretty big help at the point they're looking to fund retirement, one of the biggest headaches we all have to fund these days. And were you able to do that twice at the beginning, then not surprisingly the real value of the end sum doubles, but it's magnified by this compounding effect. That's the point. So there you have it. If you want more on some of those topics that I've covered pretty scantily in this video, do feel free to ask us for a copy of our financial fitness guides. One of them in particular is relatively new and deals with people coming up to or hitting 30. All right, and there are some useful practical steps that the boomerang generation can think about adopting to try and get them out of that kind of boomerang trap sooner rather than later. For a copy, feel free to email me at the usual place.